April 29th, 1945. A cold, pale dawn over a prison camp on the Rhine. The whistles screamed, and German women in torn uniforms stumbled from their tents, sure that this was the day things would get even worse. "Alle raus! Line up outside!" the American sergeant shouted in rough German, and they braced for beatings, hard work, or transport to a place they might never return from. But instead of boots and rifle butts, they smelled coffee, frying fat, and fresh bread drifting across the wire. Women who had served Hitler now stood shaking in line, waiting to hear an order from the enemy that would shock them more than any bomb. What the Americans said next would break their fear, twist their beliefs, and stay in their memories for the rest of their lives. Stay with me until the end to hear what really happened that morning, in the women's own words. And if you want more hidden World War II stories, please like this video, subscribe, and support the channel so we can keep telling them. The whistle blew again in the grey light. It was just after 5 in the morning. Cold air rolled in from the river and slipped through the thin canvas tents. "Aufstehen! Raus! Line up outside!" The American sergeant's voice carried down the rows, his German sharp but accented. Boots scraped on frozen ground. Blankets fell away from shoulders that had not known real sleep in days. On the far side of the wire, kitchen trucks already hissed and clanged. The women could hear metal lids, smell smoke, and something else. Fat, coffee, burned bread. The scent did not comfort them. It confused them. For years they had heard that enemy camp meant hunger, beatings, and slow death. Now, in this makeshift camp near the Rhine, they were ordered to line up while the smell of breakfast drifted over the wire. It felt like a trick, a small lie wrapped inside a bigger one. Only weeks earlier, many of these women had worn neat uniforms. Luftwaffe helpers at searchlight batteries, radio operators in underground bunkers, nurses in field hospitals behind the front. Now their skirts were muddy, their greatcoats torn, their hair tied back with string. They had not planned to become prisoners. Some were caught when their units tried to break west, away from the Red Army. Others had surrendered with whole columns of German troops near collapsing bridgeheads. One former signals helper later wrote, "We marched with the soldiers, but no one had told us what to do if the line broke. Suddenly the Americans were everywhere, and we were no longer useful to anyone." By May 1945, more than 7 million German soldiers had fallen into Allied hands across Europe. Most were men, but thousands of women in uniform and support roles were swept up with them, pushed into camps that had never been designed with them in mind. Rows of barbed wire did not care if the hands that touched them were male or female. Inside this camp, the ground was already worn to dust and mud. Wooden posts held up loops of wire that hummed when the wind rose. The nights smelled of damp earth and sweat. The mornings smelled of diesel fuel and boiled coffee from the American side. The order, "Line up outside," carried a heavy history. Under their own system, such words could mean roll call, inspection, or transport to somewhere worse. In some German camps it had meant beatings or selection, or a long march that ended at a railway siding. Now the same words came from the mouths of their enemies. A young woman from Hamburg, only 19, shivered as she stepped out in her worn boots. She remembered how Nazi radio had described the Americans as half-wild gangsters who would show no mercy. "What will they do with us?" she asked a friend in a whisper. Her friend did not answer. There were no clear answers left. The paradox was sharp. They had served a regime that promised protection and victory. Instead, that regime had collapsed, and the people who had been called barbarians were now the guards who held hot coffee. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality, and it was hard to accept. An older nurse pulled her coat tighter and watched the American sentries. They were young too, with tired faces and heavy helmets. They did not look like the monsters from posters. They looked like farm boys who had seen too much. She would later recall, "I was more afraid of what I had believed than of the men in front of me." Boots crunched on frozen soil as the line formed, shoulder to shoulder. Some women clutched small bundles of clothing or keepsakes in case this was the day they were moved again. Some stared at the ground, afraid to meet any eyes at all. Others stared at the steam rising from the American kitchen and tried not to think of home. The speakers crackled on the American side. A brief run of English words, then the interpreter repeated in German. They were to stand quiet, wait for counting, then await further orders. It sounded simple. In their heads, it was not simple at all. Behind the fear, a thin, sharp thought began to grow. Who were they now, if not helpers, nurses, fighters for a cause? What did it mean to be a prisoner in the hands of men they had been taught to hate, but who now held the only bread in sight? The cold bit through their coats as the roll call began, number by number. Names were checked against rough lists, written in haste as the front collapsed. In that long, slow count, one truth settled on them like the mist. They were no longer part of a mighty Reich. They were women behind American barbed wire, and nothing they had believed could change that. To understand why this moment felt so strange, it helps to know who these women really were, and how they had been taught to see the world before the wire closed around them. These women were not one simple group. They did not all think the same or come from the same place. Before the wire and the cold mornings, there had been warm kitchens, schoolrooms, city streets. Some came from big ports like Hamburg and Bremen, where the air smelled of coal smoke and wet rope. Others grew up on small farms where they learned to milk cows before they could read the newspaper. By 1945, the German armed forces had used more than 500,000 women as helpers. Historians count around 450,000 to 500,000 women in uniformed roles, with the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe and Navy, plus many more in air raid services and civil defense. They worked as radio operators, typists, drivers, map readers, searchlight crews and nurses. Most never carried a rifle, but they helped the machines of war keep moving. The uniforms felt strange at first. The cloth was rough on the skin, the boots heavy, the belts stiff with polish. In offices they heard the constant tap of typewriters and the ring of telephones. In hospital tents they smelled blood, carbolic and boiled bandages. Near anti-aircraft guns the air shook with blasts and the taste of metal dust settled on their tongues. Many had joined for reasons that now seemed far away. Some wanted pay and a chance to leave poor homes. Others believed the loud speeches and posters that promised honor and duty. A few hoped to escape factory work or strict parents. One former signals helper, Ilse, later wrote, "They told us it would be an adventure and that we would help protect our people." They did not talk much about death. Propaganda had drawn a clear picture of the enemy. American soldiers were called soft, lazy, and brutal at the same time. Women heard that foreign armies would treat German females as prey, not as people. In school lessons, in radio talks, in cheap magazines, the message was the same. If the enemy comes, there will be no mercy. This was the deep paradox. They had been told that German arms were strong and the enemy weak. Yet by spring 1945, American forces alone held more than 3 million German prisoners in Western Europe. The women saw long columns of men in grey uniforms without weapons, stretching for kilometers along the roads. The weak enemy had become the jailer. Most German women in uniform expected to help from a distance, not to stand in the same lines as the soldiers they had served. Nurses thought they would stay behind the front, caring for the wounded until the war ended in some clear way. Clerks and radio operators expected to be moved from one safe station to another. Few had been told what would happen if Germany lost. When capture came, it was sudden. Sometimes it meant a white cloth waved from a hospital window as American tanks rolled into town. Sometimes it meant an officer quickly ordering, "You go with them," and pointing toward the nearest group of prisoners. A former Luftwaffe helper recalled, "There was no big speech. One minute we were staff. The next minute we were just bodies in a crowd." On the other side, American officers had their own rules and papers. The Geneva Convention said prisoners should get enough food, shelter, and medical care. Women, in theory, were to be housed apart from men when possible, and pregnant women or mothers with small children were to be treated with extra care. American staff manuals spoke of enemy personnel in dry words, not of monsters. The Americans also knew that how they treated prisoners would be watched. Every loaf of bread, every blanket, every insult or kindness could become a story carried back across the ocean. And some commanders believed something else, that showing fair treatment now might make peace easier later. One US officer in a camp report wrote, "We fight the German army, not German women. Discipline must be firm, but abuse is forbidden." For the German women, this was hard to fit with what they had learned. The same system that had filled their ears with tales of enemy cruelty had sent them close to the front without a plan to protect them when defeat came. Now the cruel enemy counted them, separated them, and tried, at least on paper, to feed and house them. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality, and reality did not match the stories. The sound of typewriters in staff rooms and the roar of anti-aircraft guns had faded. In their place came the clang of camp gates, the rustle of tent canvas, the growl of American trucks. The women who had once passed orders now waited for orders. All of this shaped what they felt on that cold morning by the Rhine, and it set the stage for what came next as they began to learn what daily life behind American barbed wire would really be like. After a few days, the shock of capture turned into something else. Routine. The camp woke at the same time each morning. First came the whistle, then the shouts in English and German, boots on dirt, lines forming between the tent rows. Roll call was slow. An American sergeant read numbers from a clipboard. A German-speaking helper repeated them, sometimes getting names wrong. The women answered when they heard something close to their own. The air was often cold and damp. Breath hung in white clouds. Only after counting came breakfast. They moved in long lines toward the field kitchens, metal cups and tin bowls in hand. The smell of boiled grain and coffee substitute mixed with diesel from the trucks. The soup was thin, but it was hot. Sometimes there was a slice of white bread, softer than what many had seen in months. Official papers said each prisoner should receive about 2,000 calories a day in American-run camps in Western Europe. In truth, it was often less. Trains were late, bridges were broken, whole cities were in ruins. Still, many women thought of their families at home, where some people survived on under 1,000 calories a day. In early 1945, behind the wire, they were hungry. Outside it, people starved. One nurse later wrote, "The soup was watery and the bread was not enough, but it was regular. For the first time in weeks, I knew I would eat tomorrow." This was the strange contrast. They were prisoners, yet in some ways safer than before. Days were long. When the weather was dry, dust rose from the ground and stuck to skin and clothes. When it rained, the camp turned into a sea of mud that pulled at boots and soaked hems. The tent smelled of damp cloth, wet wool, and unwashed bodies. The Americans did not let them sit idle. Work details were formed. Some women cleaned latrines, carried water barrels, or helped in makeshift infirmaries. Others were sent under guard to clear rubble from nearby roads or move crates at a depot. They worked with bare hands, feeling the rough edges of broken bricks and splinters of wood. Rules were clear, if not gentle. No leaving the line without permission. No going near the wire, no arguing with guards. Punishment meant fewer privileges, extra work, sometimes a day without rations. But beatings were rare, and open cruelty was not allowed. For women raised on stories of Anglo-Saxon brutality, this was hard to understand. The guards shouted but did not harass them in the way they had feared. A few even tried to joke in bad German or shared cigarettes when officers were not looking. One former signals helper remembered, "I waited for the moment when the mask would fall, and they would show their true faces. It never came. Perhaps that was their true face." The camp was full of numbers. One temporary cage near the Rhine might hold 5,000 to 10,000 prisoners, sometimes more, all watched by a few hundred Americans. From above, it must have looked like a maze of wire and canvas. From inside, it felt like a crowded village with no streets and no doors. At night, sounds carried. You could hear snoring, quiet crying, the murmur of prayers. Some women whispered of home, others traded rumors. There was always a new story. "We will be sent to America to work on farms." "No, they will hand us to the Russians. They will keep us here for 10 years. The truth was simpler and more uncertain. Many American officers did not yet know how long these prisoners would stay. They had to feed, guard, and process millions of enemy soldiers and helpers while the war still burned in other places. Paperwork moved slowly. Lives waited. The great paradox grew clearer each day. Under their own flag, the women had lived with bombing, fear, and hunger. Now, under enemy guard, they stood in lines for food and counted on foreign soldiers to keep order. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality, and it did not match what either side had been promised. A cold wind cut through the tents one evening as the sun went down red over the river. The women wrapped themselves in thin blankets and waited for sleep that came in fits. Tomorrow, they thought, would be the same. Roll call, thin soup, small tasks, rumors. But not every morning was the same. Soon there would be a dawn when the usual shout, "Line up outside," meant something different. And what they saw next would shake their ideas about enemy, mercy, and power more than any speech ever could. One morning in late May 1945, the camp felt different before anyone could say why. The whistle still blew at dawn. The air was still cold enough to bite fingers and ears. Frost silvered the edges of the wire. "Aufstehen! Line up outside!" The same order, the same voices, but there were new sounds behind them. Women pulled on boots and greatcoats, still half asleep. They stepped out into the grey light and formed their usual lines. Boots scraped on hard ground. Canvas flapped in the breeze. No one spoke much. Then they heard it. The steady hiss of extra kitchen burners, the sharp crack of wooden crates being opened, metal ladles clanging against the sides of bigger pots. The smell rolled over them, stronger than before, not just thin soup. This time they smelled fried fat, real coffee, even a hint of onions and meat. The scent made stomachs twist and ache. It also made some women uneasy. Why now? What had changed? In one corner of the camp, a separate fence held the women and a few older male officers. Camp reports from similar American cages along the Rhine list around 800 to 1,000 women in such compounds, among more than 7,000 prisoners overall. They were a small group inside a huge machine, yet this morning the machine seemed to turn toward them. An American officer walked to the front, papers in hand. Beside him stood an interpreter, a German, who now wore a different uniform. The officer spoke first in English, short and firm. The interpreter followed in German, line by line. "Listen carefully. New orders today. Medical staff will examine the sick and weak. Food supplies have arrived. You will receive hot breakfast and extra rations. The sick and the women will be served first." Murmurs ran down the rows. Had they heard that right? Women first? In many German units, even as everything collapsed, men had eaten before women helpers. Now the enemy was doing the opposite. The interpreter raised his voice. "One more thing. By order of the commanding officer, no American guard is to eat until the prisoners have been served." For a second, it was very quiet. Even the kitchen sounds seemed to fade. Then someone in the front row gasped. A woman further back began to cry without meaning to. Lotte, a 21-year-old former Luftwaffe assistant, later wrote, "I had stood in lines for Hitler Youth Camp, for air raid drills, for ration cards. Never once had anyone said, 'You eat before us.' I did not know what to do with that." Medics moved along the line, checking faces and hands. They looked for fever, wounds, signs of sickness. Those who could barely stand were guided gently to one side. Blankets appeared from one of the open crates, rough wool that still smelled of factory dust and oil. The fabric scratched the skin, but it was warm. Another crate held tins of meat and powdered milk. A third held bundles of underwear and stockings, the cloth thin but dry. Some tins had English words printed in big letters. Meat, milk, soup. These were simple things, but to people who had lived on turnips and black bread, it felt like a storehouse from another world. The line began to move. One by one, the women stepped up to the serving barrels. Steam hit their faces, wet and hot. Thick porridge with pieces of meat dropped into their bowls. Coffee, real or close enough, sloshed into tin cups. The first spoonful burned tongues that had forgotten hot food. Behind them, the American kitchen crew waited. They stood by their own canteen line, empty trays in hand, watching the prisoners eat. It turned the usual picture upside down. The guards stayed hungry while the guarded filled their bowls. This was the sharp paradox of that morning. They were defeated, yet honored, with the first place in line. They had worn the badge of a master race, yet now the inferior enemy delayed his own breakfast for them. This wasn't propaganda. It was reality, walking past them with ladles and blankets. A middle-aged nurse from Cologne remembered, "I did not become grateful at once. I became confused. If they were the monsters, why did they feed us first? And if they were not monsters, what had we been doing all these years?" The air warmed slightly as the sun rose higher. Steam, food smells, and the murmur of voices wrapped around the camp. The women ate slowly, guarding each bite, as if it might vanish. They watched the Americans finally sit to eat after them. On that dawn, the simple act of who ate first became a quiet message. Power was no longer only about guns and flags. It was also about who could choose mercy and who could not. Years later, many of these women would write about this morning, trying to explain how one hot meal and one surprising order began to change the war inside their own minds. Their voices, saved in diaries, letters, and interviews, help us hear what it felt like to stand in that line and taste the enemy's food for the first time. The stories of that strange morning did not stay only in the camp. They moved onto paper, onto thin pages that smelled of dust and cheap ink. When the rules allowed, the women began to write. Some wrote in small notebooks they had hidden in their clothes. Others used Red Cross forms with only a few lines for "I am alive" and little more. Pens scratched softly in the dim light of the tents. Ilse, the former signals helper, later copied parts of her camp notes into a diary she kept after the war. She wrote, "I could not write everything then. The Americans censored our letters, but I wrote it in my head. The day they ate after us, I knew something had broken, and it was not only Germany. Censors did check the mail. Official numbers show that by late 1945, Allied offices in Europe were handling hundreds of thousands of letters from German POWs each month. Most lines were simple. I am in good health. I am in a camp near the Rhine. Do not worry." But in private, in notebooks kept for later, deeper words appeared. Marta, a nurse, remembered the first time she tasted American canned meat. She wrote, "It was salty and heavy. I was half sick from it, because my stomach was not used to such food. At the same time, I thought of my mother at home, living on a few potatoes a day. Why should I, the defeated one, eat better than she?" That was another sharp contrast. Inside the wire, food was simple but steady when supplies arrived. Outside, whole cities lay in ruins. In some bombed areas, more than half the houses were destroyed or badly damaged. Millions of Germans, men and women, had no solid roof and no regular meals. Lotta, who had stood in the front row on that special morning, told her story many years later to a historian with a tape recorder. You can hear her hesitate on the recording. She says, "They were our enemies. They had burned our cities. And there I was, wrapped in their blanket, drinking their coffee. I could not say thank you to the guard, but inside, something was saying it." The camp itself sounded different after that day. There was still the clang of gates and the calling of numbers. There was still the smell of sweat, mud, and boiled grain. But now, when the kitchen trucks rattled in, a low murmur went through the women's compound. Not just fear, something closer to hope, even if they did not trust it. Some women stayed bitter. They had lost brothers, fathers, lovers on the front. They did not want kindness from men in foreign uniforms. One wrote simply, "The food filled my stomach, but not my heart. I could not forgive them, even if they gave me their own bread." Others began to compare more quietly. They remembered German slogans about strength and care for the people. They also remembered the last winter when German leaders had still spoken of victory while city streets were full of rubble and bodies. Now the enemy followed rules, counted calories, and gave blankets without speeches. This wasn't propaganda, well, it was reality, and it stung. At night, in the tents, voices rose and fell. One woman might say, "They just want to show off for the newspapers." Another would answer, "Maybe, but I don't hear our side arguing to feed us instead of them." Arguments like this went on long after lights out. Sometimes they led to tears, sometimes to silence. The sense of touch played its own part in these memories. Hands that had held field telephones now wrapped around warm metal cups. Fingers used to sorting files now traced the rough weave of American blankets. Feet that had marched in tight boots now stood in long lines on ground that no one was bombing. Small things, but they stayed in the mind. Statistics would later show broad patterns. Millions of prisoners, thousands of camps, tons of food shipped across the ocean. But inside the wire, people did not feel statistics. They felt hunger or fullness, fear or a little less fear, cold or a little more warmth. For some German women, the camp became the first place they really met Americans as people, not as figures in posters. They saw guards share cigarettes, heard breakfast, out of simple obedience to an order of mercy. Back in their towns and villages, many women found life harder than in the camp. Rations were tiny. In some zones, adults lived for months on about 100-200 calories a day or less. Rooms were crowded with relatives and refugees. Walls were cracked, windows patched with cardboard. Families asked questions. Were you beaten? Did they starve you? Did they do worse? Some former prisoners answered with a simple line. It was not as bad as we feared. Others spoke more freely, telling of blankets, hot soup, doctors who checked the sick first. A few stayed silent, afraid that their stories would sound like praise for the enemy while their own people suffered. Marta, the nurse, remembered a sharp moment with her brother, who had fought on the Eastern Front and survived a Soviet camp. When I spoke of the Americans, he said, "You were lucky. Do not think all war is like that." He was right, but I still could not forget the morning when they stood back and let us eat first. Over time, these small stories joined with larger ones. In the West, a new German state slowly took shape. American soldiers did not just guard camps now, they helped run schools, rebuild bridges and keep order. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States sent about $13 billion of aid to Western Europe through what became known as the Marshall Plan. Some of the same country that had fed its prisoners now fed its former enemies' cities. The women who had been behind the wire watched all this with different eyes. They remembered the smell of American coffee on cold mornings more clearly than any speech about democracy. They had held U.S. blankets, eaten U.S. bread, seen U.S. guards follow rules that their own leaders had often broken. This wasn't propaganda. It was reality, and it made later promises of partnership easier to believe. They had come as conquerors. They left as students. The line could be said of many German prisoners, but it was especially true of these women. They had marched out in uniform to serve a proud Reich. They came back with questions about power, mercy, and truth. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs, but its abundance. The simple power to feed, to clothe, and to choose restraint when no one was watching. Every time them laugh at jokes, watch them write letters home by flashlight. One prisoner said, "We had been told they were animals. They looked like tired boys." These voices from behind the wire would not stay there forever. Soon, the gates would open for many. Trains and trucks would start to move them back toward a broken homeland, and they would carry these memories with them. Memories of defeat, of hunger, and of the morning when the enemy said, "You first." Those memories would shape how they spoke of America, of war, and of power in the years to come, as they crossed back over the ruined borders and tried to build a new life from the rubble. Slowly, the seasons turned around the camp. The sharp cold of early spring softened into rain and mud. Then came warmer mornings with mist rising from the river like breath. News filtered in piece by piece. The war in Europe was over. Armies stopped moving forward and started moving home. The question in every tent became the same. When will it be our turn? Lists appeared at the camp office. Names were typed on thin paper and pinned to rough boards. Groups were called out in batches. First the badly wounded, then some of the older prisoners, then helpers and nurses from certain regions. An American report from late 1946 noted that more than 5 million German prisoners had been released or handed over by the Western Allies by that time. The huge cage of war was slowly opening. One cool morning, Lotta heard her own name read out. Her heart beat so hard she could feel it in her throat. She was told to pack what little she had, a blanket, a tin cup, a pair of worn stockings from an American crate. The camp she had once feared would not let her go empty-handed. Trucks carried them first. Wooden sides, hard benches, the smell of oil and old hay. Later, trains. They sat on rough boards in freight cars, backs against the wall, knees pulled up. Through gaps in the boards, they saw Germany slide past. Broken bridges, blackened factories, villages with roofs missing like knocked-out teeth. The air through the cracks smelled of coal smoke and dust. When the trains slowed near big towns, they saw people picking through rubble, clothes grey with dirt. A woman on the ground looked up and shouted, "You had American bread while we had rats!" No one in the car answered. Ilse later wrote, "In the camp, I had been angry that the guards ate after us. On the journey home, I realized why it was dangerous. We had seen that the enemy could live better than we did, even in war. This was another deep paradox. They went home as the defeated, but they carried a hidden strength, knowledge. They had seen that rules like the Geneva Convention were not just words. They had tasted meat from tins sent across an ocean. They had watched young Americans delay their own. An American officer said, 'The prisoners eat first.' Another small crack opened in the old picture of the enemy. Through those cracks, a different future slowly began to grow. The story of those German women behind American wire is not a tale of pure kindness or simple guilt. It sits in the uneasy space between. They had helped a brutal system, and they suffered when it fell. Yet in a muddy camp by the Rhine, they met guards who followed rules, counted calories, and sometimes stepped back from the food line so that their prisoners could pass. That contrast did not erase the ruins, the dead, or the crimes of the war, but it left a mark. It showed that even in total war, people can choose how to use power, to crush or to restrain. And in that choice, quietly, the shape of the peace to come was already visible.